Keanu Reeves stood quietly in the first-class line, his modest outfit a sharp contrast to the luxury surrounding him. One man nearby looked at him with clear judgment, his arrogance on full display. What followed would leave every passenger stunned and alter a life forever. But before we dive into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're into true stories like this, be sure to hit subscribe. We've got another moving tale coming your way tomorrow. The Los Angeles airport was bustling as usual. Travelers everywhere, voices mixing and suitcases rolling in every direction. Amid all this movement stood a calm figure in the first-class line, Keanu Reeves. He wore a plaid shirt, jeans that had clearly seen better days, and worn-out boots. A rugged backpack hung on his shoulder, looking like it had been through countless journeys. Nothing about him screamed wealth or fame, yet those who paid attention would notice something different. It wasn't just his clothes, it was the peaceful aura around him. Unlike the flurry of travelers, Keanu remained composed, grounded. He looked around, fully present in the moment, unaffected by the chaos. Just behind him stood Victor Harding. Victor was Keanu's complete opposite, sharp suit, polished shoes, and a bold cologne that filled the air. Every move he made felt deliberate, as if he was putting on a show for anyone watching. His eyes swept the line until they landed on Keanu, and he smirked. "First class, huh?" Victor said with a mocking tone. "You never know who you'll find here these days." Keanu glanced at him, his expression calm and unbothered. "Yeah, the world's full of surprises." Victor paused, caught off guard by the response. He had expected more, a reaction that confirmed his assumptions. But Keanu stayed silent, unfazed. Victor pushed again. "No offense, but you don't really look like someone who flies first class," he said, letting out a small laugh. "It's rare to see someone so relaxed in first class." The boarding call had been made, and the first-class line began to inch forward. Without speaking another word, Keanu and Victor stepped ahead with tickets in hand. Victor, as expected, walked with a firm, almost boastful stride. Meanwhile, Keanu moved at the same easy, unbothered pace, as if nothing had changed. Once inside the plane, something surprising took place. Victor glanced down at his ticket once more to double-check, then looked up, only to see Keanu sliding into the seat right beside him. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He dropped into his seat with a quiet laugh, as if the whole thing was some kind of cosmic joke. Out of all the seats, it had to be this one. Keanu turned slightly, his face calm and composed, and offered a small smile. "Looks like we're seatmates," he said softly. Victor folded his arms and stared straight ahead, trying not to show how uneasy he felt. It wasn't just the awkward coincidence, it was the strange feeling that the very man he had silently mocked earlier now shared the same privileged space with him. There was something about Keanu's energy that disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. As more passengers filled the economy seats behind them, Victor leaned over slightly, breaking the silence with a question that came out casually, but wasn't as harmless as it seemed. "So, what do you do?" he asked, with the tone of someone expecting a predictable answer. Keanu, still adjusting his backpack at his feet, looked up. "I work in film," he replied with ease. Victor lifted his eyebrows as if surprised. "Oh yeah? Commercials? Indie stuff?" Keanu smiled faintly and shook his head. "Something like that." Victor chuckled. "It's funny. I've always been curious how people try to fit into places. But some spaces, they're just not for everyone. Like first class, for example." Keanu met his gaze for a second, his calm never fading. "I think everyone has their place," he said simply. "And sometimes it's exactly where they're meant to be." Victor gave a dry laugh. "That's poetic. A bit philosophical even. But life doesn't work that neatly." Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned his head toward the window, as if signaling the conversation was done. But Victor wasn't finished yet. "You know something," Victor said, leaning a little closer. "You might have the seat, but there are things money just can't buy. Some spaces will never truly belong to certain people." This time, Keanu didn't answer with words. Instead, he gave Victor a long look, one that held both quiet patience and subtle strength. It wasn't confrontational, but it carried weight, like someone who didn't need to argue to make a point. The kind of look that spoke volumes without a single word. Victor leaned back, feeling oddly victorious, a smug smile spreading across his face. He believed he had made his point and won the exchange. But beneath that surface confidence, he had no idea what was coming. While Victor assumed he was steering the situation, Keanu's calm exterior masked something unexpected. What began as a simple interaction was unfolding into something far more layered. As the plane soared above the clouds, the in-flight service began. The flight attendant gracefully moved down the aisle, attending to the first-class guests. When she reached Victor, he straightened up with a polished smile. "A glass of your best champagne," he said, clearly enjoying the moment. "Something worthy of this section." The flight attendant, used to such requests, responded with a courteous nod. Then she turned to Keanu. His request was simple. "Just water, please." Victor couldn't help himself. He glanced over, letting out a soft laugh. "Water?" he asked, almost amused. "You're really going to fly first class and not make the most of it?" Keanu took the bottle from the attendant and answered in his usual composed tone. "This is enough for me. Sometimes the simplest things are just right." Victor squinted slightly, unsure what to make of the reply. Still, he wasn't ready to let it go. "Yeah, maybe," he said, his tone more pointed. "But that's the kind of thinking people have when they settle. Not everyone's made for the finer things in life." Keanu lifted the bottle, took a sip, and remained quiet for a moment. The tone in Victor's voice was drawing subtle attention from nearby passengers, but since Keanu stayed relaxed, no one stepped in. "Maybe the best looks different to different people," Keanu eventually replied with calm certainty. Victor didn't appreciate the response. He inhaled deeply, trying to maintain his grip on the conversation. Or maybe people only say that when they've never had access to what really matters. Some things are simply out of reach for certain people. You know, the flight attendant, while tending to another guest, briefly glanced over at the two men. She appeared to consider stepping in but decided against it. Keanu seemed in control of the moment, responding with little more than a gentle smile as he turned his attention back to the view outside. Victor, however, wasn't ready to let it go. He still wanted to push further, though he was beginning to understand that rattling Keanu wasn't going to be easy. Victor thought he had the upper hand, but to the nearby passengers, his attitude was starting to feel more irritating than impressive. Meanwhile, Keanu's steady composure remained intact. Victor was about to have his assumptions challenged in a way he never saw coming, something that would shift his perception entirely. The flight attendant returned to their section of the cabin, offering more drinks to the first-class guests. As she moved down the aisle, Victor took the opportunity to pick up the conversation, or more accurately, continue his string of subtle jabs. "You know," he began, swirling his champagne, "life's a lot like flying first class. You work for it, you earn your place, and then you enjoy the rewards. But some folks," he paused for effect, "well, they just seem to get lucky." Keanu set his water down on the tray table and turned to face him, his posture still relaxed. This time, though, there was a spark in his eyes, a readiness to speak plainly. "Luck or hard work," he said evenly. "We all land in the same place when the flight's over, don't we?" His tone was composed, yet firm. The nearby passengers, who had been quietly aware of the tension, started listening more intently. A stillness settled over the cabin. Glances were exchanged as the energy between the two men became more pronounced. Victor smirked, trying to play it off, though Keanu's words had clearly struck a chord. "Well, I wouldn't go that far," he replied, voice slightly strained. "Some of us are just on another level. Not everyone really gets what it means to be up here." Keanu leaned in slightly, folding his arms as he spoke again. "I think what matters up here," he said, motioning to the seat around them, "isn't what you have, but how you treat people." The sentence lingered in the air, firm and honest. A few passengers nodded subtly. Others exchanged glances of quiet approval. Victor, on the other hand, seemed to shift uncomfortably in his seat. He let out a forced laugh, but the unease in his voice was beginning to surface. "That's a good one. First-class wisdom, huh? Maybe you missed your calling as a motivational speaker," he said, trying to lace the words with sarcasm. Keanu offered a faint smile, then turned back toward the front of the cabin, choosing silence over argument. His composure said more than any retort ever could. Around them, the subtle reactions of the nearby passengers began to shift. Some leaned in to whisper quietly, while others cast judgmental glances in Victor's direction. A few rows back, who seemed to recognize Keanu, remained silent, respecting his space but clearly admiring how he was handling things. Victor slowly began to notice the change in atmosphere. He wasn't being looked at with admiration anymore. Instead, the attention felt sharp, critical. His once confident posture began to falter, his shoulders tightening ever so slightly. Still, he wasn't ready to concede anything, not out loud. He had started this verbal match believing he held the advantage, but the growing disapproval around him told a different story. What he didn't realize yet was that the next moment would flip his perspective entirely, shaking his beliefs about status, pride, and what it truly means to command respect. As the flight attendant passed through once again to collect empty glasses, Victor sat up straighter, eager to reclaim control of the conversation he had set in motion. "You know what's funny?" he said, voice low but pointed. "It's always the people with the least who preach about being humble or keeping it simple. Ever notice that?" Keanu leaned in slightly, locking eyes with him, his expression still calm but more direct now. "I've noticed that the ones who talk the loudest about what they have," he said, "are usually the ones feeling the most hollow inside." The words landed with weight. For a moment, Victor had no comeback. He stared blankly, mouth slightly open, searching for something to say, but finding nothing quick enough. Around them, passengers exchanged knowing looks, visibly impressed by Keanu's calm and cutting reply. Victor finally spoke, trying to regain his footing. "Look, I'm not trying to be disrespectful," he said, more cautiously now. "But life's competitive. If you don't show off your success, no one pays attention. That's just how the world works." Keanu leaned back into his seat, unbothered, and answered with quiet certainty. "Maybe, but real success doesn't have to make noise. It shows up on its own." Keanu's words carried a quiet gravity. A few passengers subtly nodded in agreement, while others shot sharp glances at Victor, who clearly wasn't used to being questioned like this. By now, the entire first-class cabin had shifted its focus. What started as a private exchange was becoming the center of attention. An older gentleman nearby turned slightly in his seat, observing the scene with a shake of his head, clearly unimpressed with Victor's behavior. Victor, noticing the change in energy, tried to conceal his frustration, but rather than backing off, he leaned in again with another dismissive remark. "Sounds poetic, sure, but the world doesn't run on fairy tales," he scoffed, his voice edged with sarcasm. Keanu looked at him, his expression still as composed as ever. "The world is shaped by the choices we make, Victor, and in the end, the way we treat others says more about us than anything money or status ever could." Victor stiffened. The response had struck a nerve. He glanced around the cabin, noticing now that the eyes on him weren't curious, they were critical. Passengers murmured quietly, some watching him outright, their expressions mixed with judgment and disbelief. The confidence he wore so easily before now seemed to falter. His strategy, loud and dominant, was no longer commanding respect. If anything, Keanu's calm presence was slowly flipping the dynamic. The air in the cabin had grown heavy. Victor folded his arms tightly across his chest, trying to appear unfazed, but his discomfort was becoming more and more obvious. Keanu, meanwhile, sat comfortably in the growing silence. Then, without raising his voice, he addressed Victor again. "You know, I get what you're saying. The world is competitive. But often, the urge to constantly prove ourselves comes from somewhere deeper, a place we don't always want to acknowledge." Victor's eyes narrowed. He tilted his head, trying to decipher whether this was an attack or an invitation. "Insecurity?" he scoffed. "You've got the wrong guy. I don't need to prove anything to anyone." Keanu gave a slow, understanding smile and gently shook his head. "Maybe, but I've met a lot of people who believed success was all about appearances. In the end, they were just trying to fill something missing inside." The words hung in the air, pressing down harder than expected. Victor didn't have a quick response this time. He sat there, uncharacteristically quiet, letting the moment settle. He twisted the wedding band on his finger, his movements almost involuntary. But within seconds, he pulled himself together, regaining his defensive tone. "That's not who I am," he snapped. "Everything I've got, I earned. No one handed it to me. and I don't need someone like you telling me how to live my life." Keanu didn't react immediately. He stayed calm, like he was carefully weighing his next response. After a few moments of quiet observation, he spoke again, softly but with meaning. "I never said you didn't work for what you have," Keanu replied. "But sometimes, in our need to showcase success, we lose sight of something deeper. We forget to ask ourselves, who are we without all this?" He motioned around subtly, indicating their surroundings. Victor's jaw tightened, his lips forming a straight line. The question clearly unsettled him, though he wasn't ready to admit it. "Who are we?" Victor repeated with a dry chuckle. "We're what we create, what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Keanu met his eyes directly now, his expression more intent. "I don't see it that way," he said. "I think what really defines us is what we give, what we do for others, not what we collect. The things we own, the image we show, that's all temporary. What's inside us lasts longer." He tapped his chest gently, and a quiet ripple spread across the cabin. A few passengers nodded in agreement, while Victor shifted in his seat, struggling to stay composed. "That's easy for you to say," Victor muttered, his voice rising. "You don't know what I've gone through. You don't know my story." He was on the verge of standing, the tension clear in his movements. Keanu remained calm, firm in his tone, but never confrontational. "You're right. I don't know your past. But I don't have to understand something else. When people feel the need to constantly talk about what they've accomplished, it's often because they're trying to silence something else. A fear, a wound, a loneliness they can't admit." The words landed hard. Victor froze, the color in his face deepening. His hands clenched into fists as if trying to suppress a storm inside him. But the effort failed. With a sudden motion, he stood up, knocking over his empty champagne glass, which shattered on the floor. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. "Sitting there with your quiet wisdom like you've got life all figured out. You don't know a damn thing about what it's like in the real world." The cabin went silent. Every passenger turned toward the scene. The mood had shifted from tense curiosity to stunned disbelief. A flight attendant hurried over, trying to gently de-escalate the growing conflict. Keanu remained seated, his gaze steady and calm as he watched Victor, allowing him to finish before speaking. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "I just believe that sometimes we need to pause and consider what really matters. And Victor, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." The words hit Victor like a wave, his breath quickening. Despite his inner turmoil, something in Keanu's voice made him sit back down. He lowered his gaze, no longer angry but looking defeated, as if the weight of the conversation had drained him. Victor sat in silence, Keanu's words echoing in his mind, his sense of vulnerability growing with each passing second. He felt exposed in front of so many strangers, but what he didn't realize was that the most revealing moment was yet to come. The tension in the cabin persisted as the flight continued in a heavy silence. Victor remained in his seat, his eyes firmly away from Keanu, though it was clear he was deeply unsettled by the conversation. Keanu, however, appeared completely at ease, as if nothing had happened at all. A short time later, the flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite smile, her voice drawing the attention of the entire cabin. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The name Reeves rang through the cabin, and a few passengers who had been quietly observing suddenly widened their eyes in recognition. A quiet murmur spread through first class, and that's when Victor froze. "Reeves?" he whispered, almost in disbelief. "Keanu Reeves?" Keanu nodded politely to the flight attendant and thanked her, seeming unfazed by the sudden commotion. He turned to Victor, who now looked at him in stunned silence as if he were seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Victor?" Keanu asked, a slight smile curling at the corner of his lips. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around, noticing that other passengers were now watching him with curiosity, some even casting disapproving glances in his direction. He appeared completely lost, his confidence crumbling. As he sank back into his seat, visibly uncomfortable, he mumbled, trying to justify his earlier behavior. I had no idea. You didn't say who you were?" he stammered, his voice trailing off. "I didn't know that you were. You." Keanu, still calm, responded with a tone that held both patience and firmness. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card," Keanu said calmly, his gaze unwavering. Victor remained silent for a moment, processing the words before attempting to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Keanu exhaled a small sigh and leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying a calm but firm weight. "Victor, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." The words hit Victor hard, leaving him speechless. He glanced at Keanu and then at the other passengers, who were now all watching with rapt attention. The humiliation on his face was undeniable, and the cabin fell into a deeper silence. Keanu, sensing the weight of the moment, decided to offer one last lesson. "You know, Victor, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger." Victor nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely reflect on his actions. Keanu leaned back in his seat, signaling the end of the conversation. Meanwhile, Victor sat motionless, staring at his hands, replaying every word in his mind. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just confronted by Keanu, but by reality itself. He had tried to humiliate someone else, only to reveal more about his own insecurities than he ever intended. The rest of the flight passed in a heavy silence. Victor, who had once walked with the confidence of someone who owned the space around him, now seemed visibly uncomfortable. He could barely meet Keanu's gaze or the eyes of the other passengers, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a deep sense of shame. As the minutes ticked by, Victor found himself reflecting on Keanu's words. Everything Keanu had said seemed so simple, yet it cut through him more deeply than he expected. Victor began to question his own behavior, recalling how many times he had judged others without making an effort to understand them. "Maybe he's right," Victor murmured to himself, the realization sinking in. Unconsciously, he glanced at Keanu, who was calmly reading a book as though nothing had happened. The contrast only amplified the impact of the moment. Keanu hadn't made any effort to prove himself. He had simply let his actions speak louder than words. As the plane prepared for landing, Victor finally gathered the courage to speak. He turned toward Keanu, his eyes still lowered in humility. "I need to apologize," he said quietly. "Not for what I said, just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot," Victor admitted, his voice laced with regret. Keanu looked at him, his expression as calm and serene as ever. He waited a beat before responding. "I appreciate the apology, but more than that, I hope you learn from this." Victor nodded slowly, understanding that those words offered him a chance to change. Then Keanu added, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Victor remained silent, but Keanu's words lingered in his mind. He realized that this moment held the potential to change something deep inside him, if he was willing to let it. After disembarking, Victor stood still in the terminal, watching Keanu walk away. He observed fans discreetly approaching him to greet him and take pictures. Keanu responded to each one with patience and a genuine smile, never rushing, never acting superior. It was clear that his simplicity and kindness came from a place within. Victor looked down at his own hands, exhaling a heavy sigh. He knew that change was necessary. Keanu's words continued to echo in his mind, a reminder that true worth isn't measured by status, but by how we treat others. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd, Victor felt a stirring of something new. Hope. Maybe their encounter wasn't a coincidence. Perhaps it was a sign, a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others, or are we striving to become better people? Keanu's words were a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or flaunt, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and those around you. So the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember that respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps the change you wish to see in the world needs to begin with you. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.